Welcome back. Now, Kenyans have signed a petition asking the International Criminal Court to investigate the abductions in the country. And this follows the latest abduction of human rights activist Maria Tsehai, who has allegedly been kidnapped by 3 armed men in Kenya, and this before being released hours later. The Tanzanian independent media editor and human rights defender is known for her criticism of the Tanzanian government on a range of issues. Now, the Kenyan intelligence service has been accused of conducting abductions following widespread protest from June last year. And for more on these latest abductions in Kenya, we're joined virtually now by Irũngũ Houghton, who's section director for Amnesty International Kenya. Irũngũ, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina. Good morning, South Africans.
Perhaps a good place to start would be to just give some context in recent years with regard to abductions, be they human rights or politically related.
Well, this is not the first time we've seen an enforced disappearance. And of course, the colonial government used it in the 1940s and 50s to mass incarcerate many of our freedom fighters. More recently, in the last 6 months, we've seen up to 83 abductions allegedly by the security services, as documented by the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights. And of course, we've seen cases of refugees, the Turkish refugees, 7 in number, who were abducted, and 4 of them were forcibly returned back to Turkey just recently. And of course, the case of Dr. Kisa Besigye and the 36 other opposition parliamentarians that were essentially abducted from Kenyan soil on 2 separate occasions and taken back to Uganda. So the abduction of Maria Tsehai basically falls into that pattern of enforced disappearances.
So many are saying that this seems to point to a relapse in Kenya's human rights gains since June last year, in particular after the June 25th riots. As Amnesty International, you've also, voiced your concerns about this and about the fact that many of these abductions take place under the guise of counter-terrorism.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen the use of, I guess, what in the security services they call counterterrorism assets being used on protesters, cartoonists, people in the streets of Nairobi, people who are active on social media. And as Amnesty International, we've been saying consistently that this has to stop, that there has to be a way in which the state responds to valid, non-violent criticism of its governance record at this time. And we will continue to do so, whether it is the use of excessive force in the streets of Nairobi and other towns, or whether it is attempts to, detain unlawfully people who are speaking out on the social media platforms.
And to that point, Irũngũ, perhaps you could just explain to those who may not be au fait with what's actually happening in Kenya, what is happening with the government and those who dissent against some of what government is doing.
Yeah, well, the recently elected, I guess 2 years ago, the recently elected Kenya Kwanza administration faced a round of political party oppositional strikes and demonstrations last year. We call them the Sufuria Revolution, which was essentially a call towards reducing the cost of living, concerns about the the elections of 2022. And then this year, there's been literally a uprising of young Kenyans, young emerging leaders who have initially rallied around a finance bill that sought to increase taxes in what was considered to be a very punitive way. That has then coalesced around a movement that has basically called the government to resign. And really the last 6 months have seen tremendous pressure by the public on the government to reform itself, to clean up its human rights record, and to stop the corruption that people are very concerned about. So that's really the context for the protests that have been happening in Kenya. And of course, it's happening at a time when Kenya is extending its international profile, its reputation into the global arena. Kenya, for example, this year has just joined the UN Human Rights Council. There are some very advanced conversations about making Nairobi the capital, the third global hub of the United Nations. And of course, several other initiatives, like, for example, the initiative rallying around the Right Honorable Raila Odinga to become the next African Union Commission chairperson. So there are great international, issues at stake here also, not just domestic human rights violations concerns.
And if we look at, say, the last 5 years or so as Amnesty International, how many of these abductions have you actually reported?
Well, the Missing Voices Alliance, an alliance of several human rights organizations, including Amnesty, run a ongoing monitor, and they have a website, missingvoices.co.ke, and they have been documenting almost now for about 6 years, not just enforced disappearances, but also extrajudicial killings. On average, over this period, maybe the last decade, we've seen about 150 extrajudicial killings. And probably about 15 to 20 on average enforced disappearances. The last 6 months have seen a real spike. I mean, we've seen 83 cases of abductions, and in some cases, people have been held up to 32 days. They've not had access to lawyers, they've not had access to doctors, they have been subjected to cruel and inhuman punishment. And it's not just the analysis of human rights organizations. The president came out a week ago and acknowledged that excesses had happened under his watch and that he would bring this to an end. Only last week, in fact, to this day, 5 out of the 6 abductions that took place over the Christmas period, where there was a major twist, as 5 out of the 6 abductees were returned back or released to the public, and they are now going through psychosocial counseling and legal debriefing. So there's been major concerns, I think, over the last 6 months in terms of enforced disappearances. As South Africans will probably know, the International Convention on to End Enforced Disappearances has been in effect for several years now, and Kenya has not yet ratified that. We are now demanding that they do that and that they open up what has been happening to international scrutiny, so that we have an independent, fair, and impartial analysis of who is responsible and who must be held accountable.
And speaking of accountability, as you say, Irũngũ, government has acknowledged these abductions, but has there been any form of accountability from the security services?
We have seen no single arrest or conviction of any police officer for the 63 deaths that have happened during protests over the last 6 months, and we have seen no arrest or conviction of any police officer of any agency for the abductions that have been happening since June.
Well, just a final one, Irũngũ, with regard to those who say that you look at what's happening in Kenya now and you can trace it all the way back to the tenure of President Moi's time, and similar links can be drawn. What's your view on that? Do you think that this is something, a sort of hangover in the Kenyan body politic?
I mean, I think there are lots of parallels that can be raised with the 1990s. Just to give you an example, the number of people who have died in protests over the last 6 months are 3 times the number that died during the multi-party protests in 1990, 1991. So there are some parallels that we need to draw, but I think it's really important to make the point that in the context of this particular situation, the national government has a responsibility to uphold national sovereignty. It is insane that we should not be able to protect not just Kenyans against enforced disappearances, but actually foreigners who come to live in Kenya, not just business people like Maria, but also refugees who are protected by the UN Geneva Convention. So I think cross-border repression has to be looked at more closely, not just by the Kenyan government and human rights organizations, but I think by the international community as a whole. Otherwise, Kenya will cease to be the sanctuary for refugees and asylum seekers, as it has been for the last 30 years or more. And just to remind the listeners that, the viewers, that we have something like about 800,000 asylum seekers and refugees currently on Kenyan soil. So we have to do better at this. We have to protect people much better.
Irũngũ Houghton, thanks so much for your time this morning. And Irũngũ Houghton is a section director, Amnesty International Kenya, talking to us about the abductions in that country, including the latest kidnapping of the Tanzanian journalist Maria Tsehai, and of course, some of the other incidents that have taken place, and also government's response to it. Feel free to let us know your thoughts at Morning Live SABC.